Thank you, John. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have about 20 minutes for discussion, for your questions. You have been challenged by this panel. There were various wow moments. At the end of this discussion, I would like to have a sense of what is 1, 2, 3 in strategic priorities for the way forward. Trying to leave depressed feelings behind. There are states and countries, we don't need to go back far in history, who have found ways out of their crises. And one challenge, for instance, which Nadim put before us, is how to make it work. And you came out very clear on local initiative, rebuilding intellect, and overcoming state, society, policy, etc. failures that way. Well, some countries have maybe found it that way. Maybe you can tell us a bit more about that later on, Nadim. Turkey went the other way. It was, if you remember, rebuilding the Turkish state after the Ottoman Empire, failed state falling apart. Will it be lots of Turkeys or one? It was clearly leadership from the top and reform from the top, deep-rooted reform, which brought this country into the future. So I kick back one challenge to you, Nadim. A decentralized approach, as Alexander Solzhenitsyn, when coming home from Vermont to Russia after the Russian state had transformed, was preaching. He was preaching your tone, which was very appealing to many people in Russia, but went nowhere, or the Ataturk way. Let me put it simple like that. Sohail, I think we need to press you further on how to get it done with overcoming the information issue and to bring sound analysis into such a chaotic and difficult situation. But in the 1, 2, 3, probably security first, as John said, fiscal reform, governance, information, number 2, and the agriculture investment, number 3, hopefully simultaneously. I put this out as hypothesis. I've seen some hands up. Itisham Ahmed, please.
The numbers continue to surprise me a little bit because you had 4.9 odd refugees, whereas the entire population of Swat and Buner, I take it was, as your numbers were showing, was somewhat less than that. So I'm a little confused. Did the entire population move? And then what makes up the difference? And as you indicated, at least some people stayed behind in sympathy with the Taliban and others that couldn't get out. So presumably there's a large proportion of others in this number. Again, looking at it from the perspective that I do trying to sit on the IMF board, is what can be done about it. It's very much in the line of Joachim's thought. It's okay to think about the very fundamental questions that Nadim asked. Do we wait first for the revolution or the Taliban, for that matter, to take over? And indeed, that is the solution. And frankly, if we don't get it right, that's what's going to happen. But how do you proceed? How do you ensure good governance getting public services? How do you provide for the food and the healthcare and social services to set up the infrastructure that eventually may leave you in a position where you can start thinking about tourism? I mean, the tourism in Swat, I think, for the next 10 years is a pipe dream. Before that stage, these people have to be housed, they have to be looked after, they have to be provided with the education and healthcare. And if you don't do that, of course, the apocalypse will happen. and then you'll have the Nadeem ul-Haq solution. But I think there may be ways of addressing issues as we go along. There's a lot of goodwill. I'm not entirely sure that everybody has given up on the intellectual debate or the research. So I hope that there will be opportunities to come up both with research and with policy solutions that improve service delivery and governance.
So, no, I'm just taking from an Indian perspective. There's a lot of literature really talks about, history behind what institutions people carry. And India and Pakistan in that sense is pretty interesting. We have common origin, and we have this seesaw history of institutions going this way and that way. But Pakistan, if you'd correct me, till 1980s was, relative to India, actually was kind of a model developing country. So doing much better on social indicators and so on. And then there's a certain slide which has happened. So I don't know what is really, and just trying to pick the brain on what really explains this, sudden change, and not so much from a political point of view, but even you talk about decline on all fronts, like social indicators, society and so on. What has actually happened? And and going back to Nadeem's point of this elite capture, which is there, and having more golf courses than libraries and so on, has the affirmative action policy in India, which all of us, or a vast majority of us, are very much felt strongly against it, has something to do with, I think Pakistan didn't have a policy of strong affirmative action. And over time, I think the prescription which is given for economic development through affirmative action has also become political participation of the weaker classes. So there's something that one could prescribe for Pakistan along those lines, a strong affirmative action policy.
Thank you very much. I do one more on this side, and then and then this side is on. Please, gentlemen, pass it back there. Introduce yourself.
My name is Anwar Shah. I'm with the World Bank. And I fully agree with Nadeem's prescriptions.
Close to that.
And I think most...
Speak in the mic, please.
I agree with Nadeem's prescriptions, and I think most Pakistanis would agree with that. But the issue has always been, I think the issue is not of an intellectual debate or analysis. The fundamental issue is who will bell the cat? Who is going to bring such radical reform in Pakistan that Pakistan state becomes a much more functional, functional governance system?
Thank you. Well, Nadeem, I think a number of questions were directed to you. And then, Sohail, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, thanks. You're absolutely right on the Ataturk solution.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Hakeem. Hakeem, you're absolutely right on the Ataturk situation, and absolutely strong leadership is required. And this is what Anwar Chaudhry Shah was also saying, who will bell the cat? But I think there is also a kind of a waiting for Godot type approach here, that somehow we'll get the good leadership and they'll do something. My feeling is good leadership is also, even Ataturk was hostage to the ideas of his time. And if you take the example of Pinochet, for example, he came into power, he did the stadium thing, he did his whatever, brutal thing, and then he discovered the Chicago economists and did whatever the ideas that came from there. I think, as Keynes said, even madmen are listening to some economists, defunct economists or whatever. So I think the ideas have to be there. And this is my point. Right now, unfortunately, the public discourse in Pakistan is seriously flawed, because the fact that there is no discourse. For example, very simple. You can't publish in Pakistan, there are no journals, you can't publish in Pakistan anything other than an op-ed piece. There are no think tanks, universities are not doing any research or whatever. Even intellectual activity requires some organization, and that's the important point. John Miller and Nader Sham both said, yes, we have a few people. Nobody's saying 200 million people don't have enough, some educated people. There are some educated people, they are fragmented. They don't speak from positions of authority, like you are taking up a chair in Germany. That doesn't happen in Pakistan. So we need to organize the intellectual sector, which is what I mean. Now, Desham said one thing about public service delivery and governance. I think this is a bit of a mistake to think that governance is public service delivery. I think governance is a lot more than public service delivery. This dictum that has been pervading the debate for the last 20 years, where we are building public service delivery, we're delivering water and sanitation and health and whatever, and we forgot the community. We forgot the society. That in itself is a problem, and this is what happens. This is what Bill Easterly talks about, the seekers versus the planners approach. We've got too many planners coming in the form, as John Miller was saying, coming in the form of donors, but we've got no seekers out there. Thank you.
Sahil.
I'd just like to clarify, I mean, that I think that Ihtisham came in late or wasn't. That pie chart was basically designed to highlight the fact that 4 million people had registered, and once they sifted through all of that, found that they were actually 1.96. So that was the whole idea. They're still in the process of verification. Even these 1.96, you don't know how many of them are completely genuine, and if there are more or less, because of the information systems underlying it. So I'll just respond to the question directly and come back with opinions at the end, maybe.
There was a comment from India.
Yep.
And let's do some India-Pakistan dialogue. Nadeem is volunteering if you don't want to.
No, I'm quite happy to. By the way, I'm part of the board of this new university that's being set up in Delhi to promote better understanding across the countries, and I interact a lot with young students there as well. Your question was that what accounts for this decline in the social indicators in Pakistan that were, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we were directly or indirectly involved in conflict. And the fallout of that, we are the collateral damage that resulted from what happened in Afghanistan and later, and the corruption of society and values, etc. And the fact that very little attention was paid to education, and the whole emphasis shifted so that the emphasis now is on how to get rich quickly or how to accumulate enormous amounts of money, and that is seen in itself as the objective of life instead of better welfare for society and for oneself, is a move completely away from the social objective towards those that are much more individual and self-serving. And that is a big difference. There's a big difference between the young people in Pakistan today and the young people that are studying in India, and it's largely to do with that attitude.
John, did you want to come into the discussion at this stage?
I don't think so.
Okay, then Nadeem, did you want to add?
Then
we do one quick more round.
One simple point. I think Suhail is right, but I take a slightly different hypothesis. I think if you look at India from the very beginning, India has had serious intellectual content in its policy. From the very beginning, they've taken their own path. Look at the fact that they set up the IITs, IIMs, contrary to international advice. Look at the fact that they went in for whatever they did in terms of governance, contrary to international advice. Whereas Pakistan always followed the international advice, which is development first, as John Miller said earlier. Development first, security later. Even today, for example, the Pakistani civil service prides itself on the fact that they're all development officers. They're no longer magisterial officers. They do not want to do the magisterial work, which is the security work. And that is part of development advice too.
Now I go to this side, and I start here in the middle, and I can take two more, and then it's over. Madam.
I can talk pretty loud.
I trust, but we don't want you to stress yourself.
I have a practical question. I'd like to know how you define elite and poor, and what is the difference between the two, and is there any population between the two?
Okay.
Good question.
Sharp question. Right here. Go ahead.
My name is Chandra Ranade.
Uh-huh.
I am the co-author of the paper that John was quoting, which is published in Pakistan Development Review, which basically proves unequivocally that agriculture has to be an engine of growth to alleviate poverty. Okay, so I have a question for John and also for Nadeem and Suhail. The first question is about Afghanistan. Can we assume that stability in Afghanistan, stability and growth in Afghanistan will bring peace, automatic peace in Swat and Buner? That is the first question. And the second question I have is that in the present situation of Swat and and Buner, can we, I mean, we in the sense the international community and thinkers have some kind of action, I would say, program by not international donors, but by kind of NGOs that Norman Borlaug had successfully done in a very difficult time in Ghana. Ghana was in much worse shape than Pakistan is in 1981, 82, 83. And the country was just devastated. Norman Borlaug and Jimmy Carter went there and started Global 2000 and basically revitalized the agriculture sector. So I think one approach I was thinking in that region is to promote high-value crops, is to follow an NGO approach from people like Jimmy Carter or alike, and go in a kind of intensive way to promote agriculture, both not only at Ag Research Station, but also at agricultural education. I am not worried about extension, but in high schools. In high schools. Okay.
Brief. Okay, thank you. Right here, and I apologize to everyone else.
Thank you. Frank Young with Apt Associates. Hi, John. I just came from an event where Secretary Holbrooke and his team were addressing U.S. strategy for Pakistan and Afghanistan. And what struck me about what he said was the crosswalk between what he sees as the goals and objectives and what you've laid out here. In the priorities between security, governance and justice, and agriculture, that's virtually what he said and what his team said. His priority on governance and improving governance and the quality particularly of local governance was very much prominent. The problem I have is, and I'd like to know what your view is how you get there. His view is you need to bulk up government with resources so that they can become effective in delivering services. The problem is if you're dealing with a weak governance structure in the first place, and often a very corrupt and predatory one, you might just be enhancing the capacity for them to do bad things better. So I guess my question is, if governance is the key, and if improving local governance and local accountability and ownership is the key, how do you do that if you have no other mechanism to use other than trying to push more money through those structures that probably can't absorb them in the first place?
Thank you. John.
One of the excuses for not working through governments is that they're corrupt and inept.
And as a result, we say, well, we'll do it ourselves. I just find the whole concept that foreigners are going to develop your country a weird concept. That the country has to be developed by the nationals of that country, and if you're doing the rural sector where public goods are so important, it has to be the government that's doing it. Now, we used to put essentially all of our foreign aid through governments back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and we had fairly good devices for doing that. We understood that when we worked, we had to give an example. I worked with the Rockefeller Foundation in India in the mid-'60s. We were never allowed to hire an Indian national on our staff, with the exception of some administrative and accounting jobs. But the scientific work, you could never hire, and you weren't allowed to hire Indian nationals. But we bloody well had to work with at least 10 or 12 for each one of us that was there. But they were all in national institutions. The money wasn't put into the national institution for them to decide how to spend it. We were making those decisions, but we worked with nationals, and the nationals are out front. And when we left, there was a lot of capacity there to do research. Now, we used to put quite a lot of money into governments, and we had accounting people in USAID who knew how to look after that. And I would argue that putting money into governments that way, with the kind of controls that we had, we reduce corruption. Whereas now, when we put money in, we increase corruption. We just do it entirely differently nowadays. If we wanted to go back to the old days, we'd have to hire a lot of retired contracting officers who knew how to do it. The present ones don't know how to do those things. So you have to work with the government agencies. And we used to feel that one of our jobs was to improve those government agencies, not to accept them as they are. Now, in the case of Afghanistan, we're at the present time suddenly discovering that things have to be done through the government. So the Ministry of Agriculture, I think I'm roughly correct, has about a $50 million a year budget. We're about to put $140 million into the Ministry of Agriculture. Well, they used to accuse the Minister of Agriculture of being corrupt. The one that was accused of being corrupt, he said to me, he was a military guy at that time, was 3 times back from the present minister. He said, I made so much money off the American military, what's the point of taking peanuts out of the Minister of Agriculture? Well, we're now going to have it, so it's not peanuts, extra $140 million there, with, as far as I can see, practically no controls on it. Well, we're going to create a huge amount of additional corruption in Afghanistan. So people who are doing this think they're doing what I'm talking about, is doing things through the government. Well, that's not the way I thought things should be done through the government. There has to be some recognition of reality in that process. But the bottom line is that we should be using aid to help make governments better, not to make them worse. Thank you.
Nadine, there was a precise and intellectually sharp question.
Certainly. I'm afraid I won't be able to give you hard numbers on this thing, but you're absolutely right. The elite needs to be pinpointed and the poor need to be pinpointed, and we need to talk about what's in the middle. I think more or less everybody will agree what's in the middle is very, very thin. It's not very thick. India has an advantage. Coming back to India, India has a thicker middle class than us. I would also argue the elite is also very thin and can be easily identified by very simple means, like membership of clubs, receiver of subsidies, rent-seeking, members of parliament. Very simple, straightforward. Members of parliament, the names have not changed in the last 20 elections. They're the same people getting elected again and again. So the elite is very easily identifiable, and the poor by default or by residual are very easy. Coming back to the question of this thing about going through the government or not, I think there's also a bit of a kind of a thinking that has got stuck in the past. We keep thinking of government or not government. There is a broader society out there. Like I said, we missed out the community. We missed out civil society. We missed out academia. We missed out so many sectors of the economy. I think this is what I've come to the conclusion now is we need to think of society as a complex mechanism, and we have to deal with it as a complex structure. Within that complex structure, we have to influence everything. If you give more money to the government right now, where the norm is rent-seeking, where elite capture is at stake, we have examples before us of what happened to the social action program. $10 billion later, we discovered that, hey, the money went away, poof. We have examples of the DFID program more recently. Again, DFID gave a ton of money to Pakistan. Where has it gone? So when you've got elite capture, when you've got rent-seeking, you want to reform society. So I would argue the first thing is we have to put reform up front. What reform? For that, again, we need to go back to the drawing board. We need to bring the seekers in. We need to bring the thinkers in. We need to begin to debate reform. Thank you.
Sohail, last word. John, please let me cut you off.
Oh, no, just one sentence.
Okay, a brief one.
The one sentence is that the French should have a civilian surge in the United States to solve our health problems, okay? That explains Afghanistan.
Okay.
I think that a number of very important points have been made. One thing that troubles me all the time, and I'm sure, is the fact that there's absolutely no evaluative evidence on what works and how it can be upscaled or replicated. And that's the missing element in all of this, for Pakistan especially, but even more generally. The second point I want to make is that this comparison between India and Pakistan, unfortunately in Pakistan we've had complete turnarounds. Every time there's a new regime, there is a complete turnaround in the way you do things, and an attempt to negate everything that's happened in the past. And the third thing I want to stress is these disconnects. I mean, you're telling me Mr. Holbrooke is now saying pump this money through government. I was told some weeks ago in Pakistan, he was saying, don't trust the government, we'll move through the NGO sector. So there are these inconsistencies in messages that come across. I am a frontline partner with the USAID in Pakistan. So what I have been hearing as the program evolved has been very, very different messages every time. It's been government, it's been private sector, it's been, a combination of the three. But it's not, I mean, I go back to what Professor Meller is saying. It's not, Mr. Holbrook's issue is very minor. The problem is ours, and we need to address it. And I think that sorts of things that Nadeem's talking about are exactly the issues we need to address. We just don't know how. And that's where we start needing to build that debate and capacity.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me close with two remarks. One is a complex situation like this one, as in Pakistan, cries for research input. We obviously don't have agreement around prioritization in the political domain. So that's why this is an IFPRI issue. And we have to build that evidence base where it currently doesn't exist. That's why it's a research issue. It's not just a can-do and mobilize the money and get the security in place and then things will work. Second remark, the situation in which failed states are is one with hugely distorted incentives. Markets of violence are feeding on each other, not just markets of commodities, of inputs and of exchange, markets of violence. And if we shy away from researching them as institutional economists, and just say, you have to fix local government, you have to fix central government and get governance in place, I think we don't find the key to get into it. There were various questions where to start. So I think we have to study these institutions from an institutional economics perspective better in order to find the hook in order to move on. Lastly, I don't know how you felt about this seminar today. I think we didn't put the usual survey form on your chairs, but if it were there, I would write today. At times, it was deeply depressing, and I don't want this. Pakistan deserves better than being depressed. I spent a few days in the Muzaffarabad area after the earthquake, community and meetings mainly with women. And what impressed me so much was the will to rebuild, to take charge, to get kids back into school, and to move forward. I went with a taxi driver from Swat Valley to the airport in Kuwait. I've never been to Swat. We talked a bit about Swat, and when I said goodbye, I saw that he was in tears. He simply had talked what was going on. So a country where men cry for their country and where women are showing the will to move forward, there's hope.